You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Demonstrators are gearing up for another nationwide No King's Day protest this weekend against President Donald Trump. If you don't know what we're talking about, here's a tagline on the event's website to catch you up to speed. Reclaiming democracy, rejecting authoritarianism. For years, Americans on the left have called Trump an authoritarian, and for a lot of people, his second go in the White House has only reinforced those labels. In the past year, Trump has pardoned violent rioters who tried to keep him in office after a free and fair election, deployed the National Guard to major U.S. cities against the wishes of state governors, and called for the prosecution of his critics by the U.S. Justice Department. For a journalist like me to say that Trump has broken norms and pushed the bounds of presidential powers like never before is, at this point, cliche. And yeah, I'll add that all of this is unprecedented, so you can cross that off your bingo card. But does Trump's expansion of executive authority make him an authoritarian or a fascist, as some argue? I'm not sure I even know the distinction, frankly, between authoritarian and fascist in the first place, so it's probably good that we have two experts from the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies here with me to hash it out. By the way, the Jackson School is my alma mater department at UW. Scott Radnitz is the Ellison Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies, and Daniel Bessner is the Pyle Associate Professor in American Foreign Policy, both with the University of Washington. Thank you very much for being here, both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So we should be clear from the outset, you're both on record to some degree labeling certain actions by Trump authoritarian. We're going to dig into why and also find areas of disagreement here. I want to start with you, Professor Radnitz. Your expertise is largely in the post-Soviet region, and you study topics like authoritarianism. What is your definition for authoritarianism, just before we get too deep into current events?
So an authoritarian political system is one in which the regime, the ruler, usually the president, is unconstrained to act as it pleases. And ordinary people, civil society, right, people in organizations that are independent of the government are not protected from the state. So authoritarian rulers typically eliminate rivals to their own power, and that can come from within the government, the checks and the balances that we value so much here in the US. It can come from opposition parties. It could come from civil society. So authoritarians try to reduce the power of these rival sources of authority. Eventually, they might hope to eliminate them in a way that allows them to act as they please, to either pursue their ideological goals or to benefit themselves economically. Authoritarian regimes are usually very corrupt because they can get away with stuff and other people are powerless to stop them.
If we were going to point to examples, are we talking like military dictatorships like Pinochet? Are we thinking of Putin in Russia? Like, what are some examples in history?
Those are both great examples. There are a lot of varieties of authoritarian regimes. The old school kind that we typically associate with classical authoritarianism tend to be much more tyrannical and repressive, right? So Hitler's regime, Stalin's Soviet Union, more recently Saddam Hussein's Iraq. More recently, though, authoritarians are savvier about consolidating power. They tend not to rely on violence so much, although it often lurks in the background. They rely more and more on information. That is trying to control the media so that people are more exposed to the messages that they seek to spread. And it's harder then for the opposition to share its view of the world. And by subtly changing the rules of the game in ways that make the playing field unfair to advantage the incumbent, the president, making it harder for the opposition to organize, to hold rallies, restricting the fundraising of opposition groups or civil society in ways that can even come through the legal system. So a leader who's trying to consolidate his own regime could say everything he's doing is by the book, it's constitutional, even though little by little he's gradually ratcheting up his own authority and tilting the playing field in a way that makes it very hard for the opposition to come back to power.
Daniel Bessner, do you have anything to add to that definition that we just heard from Professor Radnitz?
No, I think it's a correct definition. I would only add that obviously we're thinking in context of the United States, and I would argue, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, that the presidency is itself an inherently authoritarian institution. And I see Trump much more as an intensification and continuation of authoritarian trends within the United States itself than departure. So I think Scott was primarily referencing other countries, at least theoretically, but I just wanted to bring it back a little bit home here.
Yeah, let's do that right now because you wrote a piece in Jacobin that's called This is America. And in it, you said, basically, I'm going to quote here, put simply, Trump and his hangers-on are building on long-standing American traditions and are using the normal tools of the American government to dismantle democracy. Trumpism is not a foreign importation. It is distinctly homegrown. I think a lot of people would say that Trump is a uniquely dangerous threat to democracy here in America. A lot of his critics would say that. Here, you're really arguing that this is a continuation of themes that are deeply familiar in America. Can you talk to me more about why you're arguing that?
Absolutely. So I do think that Trump is an intensification, but I really think it's crucial to understand him not as a departure. In the more recent past, he's most closely linked to George W. Bush, the administration of George W. Bush, the jurists of which essentially articulated a theory called the theory of the unitary executive, which is the notion that the president, much more so than Congress or the judicial branch, has the responsibility and authority to deal with things relating to the executive branch, broadly defined. And since most of the government is actually in the executive branch, that was a decision that was made during the period of American political development over the course of the 20th century. There are very powerful legal arguments and legal precedents that give Trump the authority to do what he's doing. Not to say that I necessarily agree. I don't agree with much of what Trump is doing, but it is certainly not a departure. One thing that I like to point out is people often point to Trump's executive orders as, being a departure, being something unique. He's governing through executive orders. Not to do a little quiz, but do you know which president has used the most executive orders in American history by any chance?
Ooh, I love a quiz though. The most? I am going to guess that you are comparing something more recent. So is it Biden?
No, it is not. It is Franklin Delano Roosevelt who enacted.
Oh, I could have guessed that. I love it. Yeah.
So Roosevelt enacted 3,726 executive orders, which is orders of magnitude more than any other president has in American history, because Roosevelt was essentially governing through executive order via executive order during a moment of incredible crisis. So this is all to say that what Trump is doing is very much in concert with the powers that have been delegated both officially and unofficially to the American president. And I think that is really where we need to focus. If people have a problem with Trump, they have a problem with the presidency itself. And that's something we need to articulate.
You brought up the F word there, fascism. I just want to put a pin in that because we're going to get to it in a little bit. Before we turn to that, though, Professor Radnitz, we've heard these arguments from Daniel Bessner about the ways in which basically the American system and the way that it's been set up, Trump has been exploiting and maybe intensifying, but is not out of line with tradition in some ways in American executive power. What do you think about that? And then also, how are you feeling about Trump's level of uniqueness in history?
So, yeah, I would point out that the way the system is designed, the way that the political theorists who designed the American constitutional system had envisioned was that there would be three branches of government, and they were designed to check each other so that no branch became overly powerful. In the past, president and Congress, even when they're headed by the same party, were not always aligned on every issue. What's happened recently is that due to polarization among the political parties, the Democrats are highly united, as they were under Biden for the most part, and Republicans are extremely supportive of everything Trump does, or at least they're afraid to openly oppose him. And the result is that Congress is not performing its constitutional duties. It's not representing its constituents as its representatives are supposed to. And that's allowed Trump to govern as if Congress isn't even there, as if there's no legislature. In other authoritarian regimes, presidents have ways of emasculating the legislature, making sure that their political opponents can't run for office, or changing the rules so that it becomes too hard for the opposition party to gain a minimal number of seats to oppose them. In the US, that hasn't happened yet. We still have a two-party system, and Democrats are close to a majority in the House of Representatives. And yet, Congress is allowing Trump to do essentially whatever he wants. And de facto, then, this country looks like a regime that is pretty far along in its authoritarian trajectory, like Russia after 5 or 6 years, or Hungary after 6 or 7 years. Sometimes it takes a long time for authoritarian leaders to eliminate the opposition from within the government. And in this case, because Republicans have gone along with Trump, it's happened very rapidly.
You talked a little bit about congressional abdication of the powers of that body. I'm thinking about congressional power to appropriate funds, which then Trump has said he has the ability to say we're going to spend it or not from the executive branch. Are there any other examples for you, Professor Radnitz, especially when we're talking about comparisons to Hungary or Russia, that stick out about Trump's recent actions that you feel like are, stepping stones along the way to this authoritarian model?
One hallmark of authoritarian systems is that they use the legal system strategically in ways to benefit their allies and punish their enemies. So laws become tools of authoritarian rule. The rule of law in a democracy is supposed to treat everybody, at least in theory, equally, and the federal government is designed to apply those laws as they're written in ways that don't privilege one group over another, whether it's political parties or racial groups. Of course, in this country, that has often not been the case. Today, to a much greater extent than ever before, even compared to the Nixon administration, Trump has appropriated the Justice Department for his own political purposes.
Okay, we're going to pause here for just a minute. You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. I'm talking with two professors at the University of Washington's Jackson School of International Studies about why they think Trump fits the definition of an authoritarian and how he fits in a historical and global context. Scott Radnitz is the Ellison Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies, and Daniel Bessner is the Pyle Associate Professor in American Foreign Policy, both with UW. When we come back, we'll get into the F word, fascist, whether that label fits the Trump administration, Trump's policies, and whether it's a useful one for the left. That's in just a minute on KUOW. Welcome back to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman, here with Daniel Bessner and Scott Radnitz, professors in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. We're talking about the definition of authoritarianism and where President Trump falls on a spectrum of authoritarianism. Professor Bessner, I think it's fair to say you're a critic of capitalism. You are on the far left of the political spectrum as we know it in America. And just to catch people up, you kind of stirred up some feathers with other folks on the left, liberals, after you said that you don't believe that fascism or fascist is a helpful or accurate term to apply to Trump. And you were basically talking about the ways that he fits in a historical context. Can you kind of explore that with me? And then we're going to launch into more of a general conversation about fascism and what it means.
Sure. Well, I think it's been proven to not be politically helpful. Kamala Harris referred to Trump as a fascist. Other associates of the Harris campaign referred to Trump as a fascist, and it didn't work. The Democrats didn't win the election. So I think there's serious doubts about its political utility. This is not to say if someone, wants to put the word fascist on a placard at a protest, more power to you. It's functioning in a different context there. It essentially is functioning as a curse word, political curse word that makes clear that you really disagree with whoever you're calling a fascist. And that is effectively how the term has been used in American history since roughly the late 1960s. Basically, every president has been called a fascist since the 1960s. Even more recently, you can remember Jonah Goldberg talking about liberal fascism. It essentially is what scholars refer to as a floating signifier. It functions more to designate something as really bad than as a clear analytical term. And I would say analytically, whatever is happening in the United States is very different than what happened in Italy in the 1920s and 1930s and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. The contexts are just extraordinarily different.
And can I just pause you there? Because I think for
please
folks who maybe are listening and we're talking about authoritarianism, there's like a Venn diagram here, right? Where all fascists are authoritarians, but there are not all authoritarians are fascists. So can you kind of define fascism for us, just so we have a set of terms to go from?
Yeah, so I define fascism historically. It was a particular response to the question of how to manage a modern industrial economy. It emerged from World War I, the particularly traumatic experience of the war and the trenches. It's not for nothing that many of the early fascists, both in Italy and Nazi Germany, were themselves veterans of World War I, including Hitler, of course. I think it was particularly linked to a moment in political development where you could have armed gangs roaming streets and really affirm authority in a way that is very difficult to do today. Given the power of the American military, I think it was also linked to a particular moment in the history of capitalism with the Great Depression. I think that it was also linked to a moment where there was an actually powerful left that offered a genuine alternative to how to govern a modern industrial economy. So I just think that the contexts are so extraordinarily different that the use of the term in an analytical sense actually obscures what's really going on, which to my mind, at least, and then I'll stop, is linked to the longstanding American traditions that have been developing in this country for, at this point, centuries.
Professor Radnitz, I wonder if you could reflect on the definition that we heard there from Professor Bessner, and then also your feelings about the use of fascist to refer to Trump. Obviously, a pejorative term used by many to talk about their political rivals, but if we are in a truly unique moment here with Trump consolidating power, is it too far to use that label today?
So I agree with Daniel that using that label can be unhelpful because of the way the term has been overused and misused and thrown around as an epithet. But analytically, it may be useful to look at some of the practices and actions that the Trump administration has engaged in that are reminiscent of that kind of regime in the past. And it's also worth pointing out here that every regime is unique. So we don't have a full picture yet, but it's not going to be a poster child. It's not going to be an obvious echo of something that we've seen in the past. That said, I want to point out a couple things that are reminiscent of fascist regimes of the past. One is the valorization and glorification of violence, a hallmark of every fascist regime. And you see the Trump administration making major public spectacles of using violence, using excessive force against citizens through the actions of ICE when it comes to immigration raids, through the federalization of the National Guard, and working to get those troops more involved in dealing with ordinary citizens, which is something that they're not really trained to do. And then trumpeting these violent encounters on social media and celebrating them. A major part of fascism is also spectacle, producing major public events that are visible and that resonate and that will inspire either loyalty and support among their followers or opposition among the opposition party. And related to that is also a lot of symbolism of masculinity, manliness, valorizing machismo, force, all things military. I think you see some of this embodied in Pete Hegseth and the way that he talks about the military, claiming it's too woke and too feminine, and how he wants men to be fit and to exercise and to shave and to look like men of the past of a certain image, going back into the 20th century. So while it isn't necessarily consciously trying to emulate fascist regimes of the past, you do see elements that it sees as convenient or useful in its political projects.
So I want to just talk a little bit about where we're at. I guess if somebody wants to imagine a continuum from perfectly egalitarian democracy where opposition is is celebrated and freely able to oppose, to like full-on authoritarianism or fascism, like where we're at in the spectrum. You know, the Trump administration has, of course, at times ignored the checks and balances that are built, many times ignored the checks and balances that are built into our system, the court orders, the case of the deportation flights of Venezuelan immigrants sent without a hearing to a major super prison in El Salvador, for example. But now we see that there have been these checks that have, reared up and at least temporarily pushed back. The judicial rulings have stalled the use of CCOT and the Alien Enemies Act for deportations. Lisa Cook is still on the board of the Federal Reserve. All of this could be temporary because it's still working its way through the appeals process in the courts. But these kinds of obstacles, they don't happen in a country that's like completely devoid of checks and balances, right? So I guess my question is, where do you think we're actually at if there is like a if there is this continuum between democracy and authoritarianism? Bessner and then Radnitz.
I think that Trump is making extensive use and pushing boundaries on the theory of the unitary executive. I think Congress has long abdicated its responsibilities in a number of issue areas. Here's another quiz, Libby. When was the last time the United States declared war? Do you know?
Officially declared war?
Declared war, like in
with
the Constitution.
Congress,
yes,
making
the
that.
Congress says, yeah.
2001?
1942. The United States has not officially declared war since 1942. Good thing the United States has fought no war since then. I'm just kidding. The United States has fought many wars since then. In fact, the period since World War II has been the most violent in the nation's history. So Congress has long abdicated its responsibilities in the realm of foreign policy. And I think what we've seen is Congress increasingly abdicating its responsibilities in other issue areas. So we've been on a democratic backslide for a very, very long time. And I see Trump as a natural upshot of these long-term American processes.
For you, Scott Radnitz, where do we stand if we are on this continuum between what an ideal democracy might look like, whatever that might be, if that's ever existed, and authoritarianism?
So I'll start my timeline a little bit more recently. I would say things are moving very fast, and it's hard to take a snapshot any week and say this is where we are, because things are going to change again. So I would say the trajectory is worrying, even though Trump has not achieved victory in all of his battles. I would say he's winning most of them. And for now, there are going to be elections this November in lots of states, not for anything major, not for anything national. There is a planned election for November 2026. That's still going to happen unless something changes. For now, people can still protest. There's going to be a big one in Seattle, as you mentioned at the start of this interview. For now, comedians can still mock Trump on television, although that's also subject to change. What I would look for that would be especially concerning is for the administration to carry through on its threats to go after leftist organizations, that is, organizations in civil society that usually fund pro-democratic and pro-democracy groups that Stephen Miller, one of Trump's advisors, has threatened to target legally or through the taxation system. If they follow through on these threats, then this will be extremely troubling because it's, again, a classic authoritarian tactic of using the legal system to try to destroy the opposition.
Yeah, I think that this both claim that there was some kind of funding and organization that can be gone after to respond to like the Charlie Kirk assassination, the conversations following that, J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller and others saying that basically even using terms like authoritarianism and fascism can be considered incitement to violence, and the ways that they've been trying to build a case around that. It does bring to mind this elements of authoritarianism that involve, the suppression of opposition and the making opposition impossible or very difficult. Any final thoughts here before we go? Professor Daniel Bessner and Professor Scott Radnitz, just like a minute left here. So if we could keep it brief, but any final thoughts for Bessner first and then Radnitz?
I think it's a fluid situation, and I think it's important to understand Trump as a continuation and intensification of longstanding American trends as opposed to a departure or a foreign importation.
I would place the U.S. In comparative perspective. The classic modern authoritarians that he's often compared to, that political scientists tend to refer to, who have perfected this model of soft authoritarian rule, like Modi in India, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Russia under Putin. It all took them quite a few years to really gain control over the system. They built their regimes gradually over time in ways that were kind of subtle and hard to miss at first. Whereas Trump has come charging out of the gate, wasted no time in doing a lot of things that would have taken other regimes years to accomplish. But one difference between those leaders that I just mentioned and Trump now is that those leaders were all genuinely popular, usually with supermajority support. And in the case of Turkey and Hungary, the leaders also had a majority and sometimes a supermajority in parliament that was legitimately elected because these leaders and their ideas were truly popular. Today, Trump does not have majority support. Even though Republicans control Congress, recent polling has shown that the majority of the public disapproves of most of Trump's recent actions, whether it's about tariffs or immigration or ICE raids and the state of the economy. If this persists and if there are free and fair elections, then that will provide chances for the opposition, for the Democratic Party, to come back and challenge Trump's power.
You just heard from two professors from the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. That last voice was Scott Radnitz, the Ellison Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies with the Jackson School. And you also heard from Daniel Bessner, the Pyle Associate Professor in American Foreign Policy with the Jackson School. And by the way, Dan Bessner also has a podcast available, folks. It's called American Prestige. I'm assuming you can find that anywhere you get your podcasts, Dan?
Yep, anywhere you get your podcasts.
American Prestige. That I'm wondering if that's a is American Prestige sarcastic?
Everyone should look at the logo and then decide for themselves.
All right. Again, thank you to Dan Bessner and Scott Radnitz. I really appreciate your time, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.